Today's lobbyist, don't like to call him a guest, is John Bulloch, CH, President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. But when I first met you about 10 years ago, you had some tiny little two-bit organization you were trying to get off the ground. What was that called?
The Canadian Council for Fair Taxation. It was a kind of a protest against Benson's white paper, and then from that we rolled it into this permanent body.
And now you're the $75,000 a year director of how many people?
55,000 companies.
What have you achieved?
Well, we've achieved probably over $1 billion a year in tax changes alone, plus we've influenced probably every business bill in Canada over the last 5 or 6 years.
All right, let's look at the election. You're from Ontario, aren't you?
Yeah.
You were happy, of course, with the election.
No, not really. One way or the other, it doesn't matter to me. Get them away from television, they're all the same, Jack.
What do you mean they're all the same away from television?
Well, you can only tell party differences when they're speaking on television. If you get them in committees behind the room, you couldn't tell whether they're Liberals or NDP or Conservative unless they put signs on their foreheads.
In other words, the whole media campaign, the whole media reportage is just a lot of hypocritical gobbledygook.
It's what you call good theater.
Good theater.
Good theater.
Nobody
Jack.
ever tells the truth on television.
Of course not. No,
no politician.
Politics has got nothing to do with people, Jack. Politics is backroom boys and network television. That's all it is.
Image and backroom boys.
That's right.
The cabinet today. What's going to happen?
Well, I don't think the newspaper reports are too far off. I would expect Herb Gray in industry, and I'd expect McKechnie in finance, as is reported, and perhaps Axworthy in a major Western portfolio such as transport, and probably Lalonde in energy, although that may create some public problems.
You mean if they put Lalonde, the French-Canadian, into the energy ministry against Lougheed, that might cause some difficulties, you think?
I don't think there's going to be any difficulty over energy pricing. I think that's another trumped-up media event. But it might be perceived as a source of confrontation.
Trudeau sat here and said, vote Liberal and get cheap oil and gas.
Oh, that's politics. They fought the 18-cent election, which had nothing to do with Alberta, the 18-cent tax, but the $4 a barrel is going to be no problem. What Trudeau has to do is make it look like it's a different price, but the same price. Make a blended price look like it's not a blended price. It's strictly politics.
Without the 18-cent excise tax.
That's right. They'll be raising taxes in other ways.
Now, what's the state of the small businessmen in the nation today?
Well, I would say a little apprehensive, but the 80s look pretty good, Jack. There's lots of problems ahead. We've got terrible shortages of skilled people. We've got lots of problems with interest rates and financing.
Oh, we need more immigration.
Well, we will be bringing in people. There's no question. Right in the next 2 years in the province next to you here, the oil sands plant, the coal to lake plant will require 40,000 skilled people, and they just aren't in Canada. And they'll be bringing them in on probably temporary visas.
Do you remember Gaye was going to bring in 40,000 Koreans to work the oil sands, the tar sands plant?
That's right.
Maybe he wasn't as daft as we thought he was at the time.
Jack, we can blow the biggest opportunity in our history if we're not smart, because you can use American capital, American engineering, American equipment, and South Koreans and develop the whole country the next 20 years if you want to. Now, we have a phenomenal opportunity, but we've got to develop the skilled manpower. We've got to direct savings into these projects. We've got to make sure small business aren't hurt as a result of these projects and get a piece of the action. It's a very exciting opportunity for every single province in Canada, but if we're stupid, we'll blow it.
That's what you want to see. You want to see American capital, American know-how, cheap labor from overseas.
No, I want to
give the businessman an expanded market.
No, I want to see more domestic capital financing these projects. I want to see the engineering in Canada, the specifications in Canada, the project management in Canada, and a bigger piece of the industrial equipment, the sophisticated equipment made in Canada. So I want a very strong central government to make sure that all of these projects don't result in tremendous benefits to other parts of the world.
You of course, take the classic position, I suppose, that unions are too big and too strong in this country, and they hamper the small businessman very much indeed.
In some areas, Jack, unions are only are only organized in about 10% of small business. The organizations like the Manufacturers Association, they're all organized, but our membership, only about 10% are organized. So some groups, like contractors, have lots of areas of conflict, but generally speaking, unions aren't the source of pressure for the vast bulk of small business. They're more pressured on things like interest rates. They're more pressured on terms like financing or competing with big companies for skilled people. These are their problems.
All right, what are you lobbying the new government for? What are you representing? What did you say, 55,000 small businesses?
Yes.
Representing how many people, do you think?
Well, our own membership employs about 750,000 Canadians, but the small business sector itself employs over half of the private sector.
All right, what are you going to be lobbying for specifically to help you through this magnificent prospect of the expanded industry and economy of Canada in the 80s?
Probably two major issues. A redirection of the money we spend on manpower training. We want more money directed to on-the-job training and more skilled people trained in smaller firms.
Just a minute, what do you mean by that?
Well, the trouble is
subsidies to employers.
Well, right now we're spending $1 billion, Jack, and we've got a massive shortage of skilled manpower. The money's going the wrong way. It's too much of it's institutional. It's the wrong kind of training. It's short-term training. We want longer-term, on-the-job training, even if it's a form of payroll levy where all employers contribute to the funding of it. But the kind of training we're giving now, we spend I think we're the second highest in the Western world on dollars going to manpower development, and yet we have a massive shortage of skilled people in Canada. It's holding down the whole Western development.
You're saying there's $1 billion goes to institutions like BCIT, vocational training?
There's $1 billion at the federal level spent on all forms of manpower development. And
if you include the provincial, it's got to be several.
Yes, that's just the federal. That's just the federal level, and yet we have massive shortages. So we've had the wrong kind of training, and right now, if you talk to any business in the Western Canada, Jack, and not just Alberta, any Western Canada businessman will tell you that his future is going to be determined by his ability to get skilled people. And capital is going to be not nearly as serious a problem as skills. And the whole development of the West, which has got a boom decade ahead of it, is going to be determined by the people problem as opposed to more than anything else.
Are you suggesting to me that this $1 billion of federal funds that goes into institutional training is largely being misused as kind of guaranteed incomes for people who sit in classrooms?
Well, I would say it's the wrong kind. It needs to be for longer periods of time. It needs to be on-the-job training. And the difference between Canada and Europe is that in Europe, 60% of all the people with skills are trained in small firms. And in Canada, they're trained in big firms and they're trained in institutions. And small firms are fearful of spending, say, $20,000 training a man, because as soon as he's trained, a major project will steal him for twice the money.
So therefore, it's your people who are to blame for the lack of skills in the small business area?
No, it's the method of funding. In Europe, for example, it's all done on a payroll levy, and everybody, if a small firm trains somebody, he gets paid for the training, and then he contributes to on a payroll levy to the training, so that everybody shares the training, and the cost is shared. Right now, we've got to get massive redirection of federal and provincial money into training, because nothing else will determine the growth of BC and Alberta in the West than skills. And they steal them from the small firms. So when you get a major project in the West, where are the small? I mean, you get a fellow that's working for a service station. He's a mechanic. What does he do? He becomes a security guard for twice the money. So we lose the skills of a mechanic, and a major project steals them. We've got a very serious problem. And when you have a major project in the West, you steal them from coast to coast. They're coming in from New Brunswick and Ontario and Quebec and BC. We've got to tackle this nationally. You can't tackle it just in one province.
Next, I want to ask you about this $1 billion in tax cuts you got for your people after the break. John Bulloch, President of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businessmen. Well, you're very proud of what you've done. I think you said that in the past 8 or 9 or 10 years, you've achieved $1 billion in tax benefits for your people?
Well, this is for the small firm sector across Canada. 10 years ago, small firms had no political muscle, and they were the highest taxed in the Western world. And now our tax rates are competitive with all the Western industrial countries. I started this whole business 10 years ago when government said, let's tax small business at a 50% rate, but big business with their special capital incentives were actually only paying about 25%.
Well, Shell paid no tax at all, according to Mr. Broadbent.
Well, there's a whole lot of other weirdo things in our tax system which enables some major firms to pay very little tax at all.
Can you defer taxes in small business like the big boys do?
They don't have tax deferrals the same way. They just have a lower rate for a limited amount of earnings so that you can build up an equity base.
Do you have a 27 1/4 or a 30% rate?
Yeah, it's around about 25 to 30% depending on the province.
On undistributed profits?
Yes, and then once you distribute, of course, it's taxable. But you're allowed to build up a certain amount of earnings at a lower rate and build up your equity base, and that is what gives a lot of strength.
When you go to borrow for your business, and I've had lots of screams about this, do you get any preferential treatment in the way of loans or guarantees from the government?
You mean small business generally?
Yeah, generally.
Well, generally speaking, I'd say over 95% of small business borrow through the normal chartered banks. There are other types of loan programs, federal guaranteed loans for special types of businesses, and there's Federal Business Development Bank as an institution that does funding. There's provincial agencies that do funding. There's a whole lot of other people in the financing game, but about 95% of all the money does come through the conventional banks.
And what's the prime rate now?
Well, the prime rate now in Canada is about is 15%. That would put small business interest rates in most cases up around 16.5, in some cases as high as 17.
And if you wanted it without the proper collateral, you got to go elsewhere.
Well, yes. In some cases, you might be able to get the funding under the Small Business Loans Act, which is for small firms that don't have enough collateral, and that they have put about $250 million out in the last year under that program. But the real issue is the interest rate level generally, not the range.
Before you come to that, though, what did Huntington do for you when he was small business
Not too much.
minister? No,
he was just getting ready to roll, and when the plug was pulled. So
what do you want the new government to do for small business loans?
Well, in the Small Business Loans Act, we'd like to see some amendments to the act so that the money goes to the people that need it most. We'd like to see...
Who's that? The ones that are going broke?
The ones that don't have enough collateral but are a good risk. Right now, they don't charge for the loans so that people get them that don't need them. So the thing has to be just technically improved. So that's not going to be a problem. And we're looking for a better equity base for the FBDB. We're looking for tax changes that would put risk money. The real issue in the next few years is competing with the major projects for capital. We want to find ways of directing people's savings out of RRSPs into riskier ventures, and we'll be dealing with that as a result of federal tax changes and provincial tax changes.
In other words, you're lobbying for a better or no capital gain on gains in Canadian shareholdings.
We're looking for ways to stream savings away from large conventional institutions into riskier ventures. And
how can you do that?
Well, you can do it a number of ways. For example, the province of BC, along with 4 or 5 others, are going to set up small business development companies in which people like yourself can put in $1,000 and get a tax credit, and then that money is then streamlined into new and small ventures. That's underway. The officials are working on that one. And the federal level, changes in capital losses and capital gains taxes can also make it attractive for people to take minority positions in small business.
Is it time capital gains was wiped out?
Well, I don't think they'll wipe it out because it's now starting to pull in so much money and they've got a $12 billion deficit. But I think they can fiddle with it. They could make changes in the capital gains tax. Taxes do have a traumatic effect on small business. I often say that small businessmen are all separatists, Jack. They want to separate from the Department of National Revenue, you know, and all the programs of government mean nothing compared to a tax cut. They understand taxes and they respond to tax changes. So we tend to spend more of our time in the tax area, but governments, you can't stop the bureaucrats from playing their games. They'll develop all kinds of programs on top of it.
All right, what about interest rates? What's going to happen to interest rates, do you think, under this government or under any government?
I think we're going to see a reduction in interest rates at the federal level. I think that the moment Governor Bowie gets the signal from the new finance minister that they're going to get an oil pricing agreement shortly, they're going to have a fiscally responsible budget, that there'll be such a massive inflow of capital from all over the world in this country, we're going to be worried about our dollar being too high. And we'll be able to follow a more independent interest rate policy in the United States.
It doesn't sound like you've been in the same election campaign as I was in.
Of course not.
You're telling me there's going to be a massive inflow of capital into a new, burgeoning, enthusiastic Canada.
Right.
Why?
2 things. One is the massive oil developments, Sable Island and Hibernia on the East Coast. And number 2, the increasing instability of the Middle East. We are probably the only Western industrialized country that has the capability of becoming independent of the Middle East in terms of oil supply. And we'll probably be one of the top 2, 3 stable investment opportunities, and there's $120 billion floating around the world looking for havens, and what I'm worried about is too much money coming in and killing your tourism here, your forest industry. We'd like to keep the dollar at 85, but it's going to be very hard to keep the dollar below 90. The major corporations planning for the 1980s are planning on a dollar at par because of the potential pressures coming into Canada over the next 10 years. We've got $200 billion in energy projects alone on the drawing board, and I speak as a member of the Bob Blair's Major Projects Task Force. In the next 20 years, there's a potential of $1.4 trillion in major resource-based projects in Canada. The next 20 years are going to be Canada's, and our problem is, all of our problems are going to be because we've got so many opportunities. It's going to be shortage of skills and shortage of materials.
What you're telling me is that it didn't matter a damn who won the election anyway.
Of course not. It never does.
You're like a man from outer space.
Well, Jack, as long as you have majority government, that's all that matters. Majority mattered.
It doesn't matter that it's split up east and west.
Oh, not
or
a bit.
Quebec's a
Oh,
block
no,
and Alberta
no.
and BC
You don't
and a
want,
block.
you don't want people in the cabinet out here, Jack.
They do better outside the cabinet.
Of course.
Oh, we're going to have Senator Ray Perot in the
You
cabinet.
don't want people in the cabinet, Jack. If you have nobody in the cabinet, they'll pay twice as much attention because you'll be able to hit them every morning on your show about connecting the West. You'll get 10
We don't have to, though. Prosperity is rolling round the corner, according to John Bulloch.
Of course, you can drop a
We've only got 800,000
That's
unemployed.
That's right. You can drop a nuclear bomb on Ottawa and you'll still have a boom economy.
Are you suggesting such as a practical measure?
Not as a practical measure, it was a theoretical measure.
I'm going to take calls to the ebullient Bulloch after the break.